Computer chips get hot, so we have to cool them. And we have two options: passive cooling or active cooling. Passive means that we are not using any electricity. And for example, if you look here, we have our chipset. This has a heat sink on it, which is passive. It doesn't use any power, but it pulls heat away from the chip. And you have all kinds of examples of passive cooling. It could be on a motherboard, it could be on a video card. For example, if we show this video card here, this has a heat sink with fins, and this pulls heat away from the GPU on the video card. But again, that's passive. There's no fan and no power required. But if you need to do more cooling, if you need to do some serious cooling, then you're going to need active cooling, and that means incorporating some type of more advanced system. Usually, this means using a fan. So if we look at this image here, we'll see that we have a CPU with a heat sink and a fan. And the heat sink pulls heat away from the CPU. The fan plugs into the motherboard and actually gets power to turn and blows the heat through the fins of the CPU. In some cases, the fan will pull the heat from the CPU. It depends on the computer. Here's a more advanced example. This is a Cooler Master, and this has a heat sink here. It's actually covered with the label, if you can see that. And you can see it's a pretty massive device, a heat sink with tubes inside it, and a fan as well. And so the Cooler Master is really big. This is actually going to go on the CPU this way. And it's really big, so it's going to pull a lot of heat away from the CPU, as opposed to using a standard size heatsink and fan. And I want to do that because I'm going to be crunching a lot of data on this computer. It's going to be doing a lot of video and audio rendering, and the CPU is going to run hot. I can guarantee that. Even though it's a Core i7, it's going to run hot when we do our video and audio editing and rendering. So the big heatsink and fan is what we're going to use with that. And that's another example of active cooling. The fan plugs into the motherboard, or you connect it directly to a Molex connector with an adapter into the power supply. And we'll show more about that when we get into power. Now, when you connect your heatsink to your CPU, you want to use a thermal paste or thermal compound. And something like this, Arctic Silver, has been one of my best friends. I use it all the time. Normally, you'll apply this to the CPU cap, but you might also prime the heatsink. It's also known as tinting, and we'll talk more about that when we do the installation of the CPU. So what you need to take away from this is that there's two main types of cooling. There's passive, which does not require power. As we mentioned, passive heat sinks with no fan, no power required, pull heat away from the chip, or in the case of the video card, the GPU. And then you have your active, which uses a fan, requires power. And again, as you can see in the figure, you have a heat sink and fan. And then you have this more advanced, bigger version with a very large heat sink and a very large fan. It's going to take up a lot of space, but it's going to move a lot of heat away from the CPU.
Usually, the heatsink and fan combination is enough to cool your CPU. However, if you're an enthusiast or you use a more powerful workstation for design or audio-video editing, you may want to use a liquid cooling system. And there's a variety of options for liquid cooling, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But generally, the heatsink and fan is good enough for, say, 70–80% of the computers out there.
So here's an example of a liquid cooling system. And you can see here we have the heatsink portion, which acts as a radiator and has send and receive tubes for the coolant. And then that heat is transferred out through the fans outside the case of the computer. So if you are an enthusiast or you're going to be crunching a lot of data, you might be interested in something like this. And you want to make sure you have the correct type depending on your CPU and your needs. And when you install it, you want to make sure you install the right bracket. And for us, for example, that's going to be the 2011, actually the 2011-3. And all these brackets usually come with these devices. In the past, these systems were much more advanced and more difficult to install, I should say. And there was a chance of a leak as well. And installing the pump and all that kind of stuff could get a little bit chancy. And you wouldn't want to do this type of thing on a production computer or a mission critical system and most business systems. Again, it's really for the system that is used by the gamer or by maybe an audio video editor that's going to be really crunching a lot of data and rendering information and needs to do so at high speed. And thus the CPU is working really hard. And anybody that's overclocking, these are the types of people that'll be interested in this type of device. Now, by the way, we were talking about the heatsink and fan, that gigantic heatsink we showed. And you want to make sure that you install thermal compound, and you want to make sure that you install it properly. I like to use Arctic Silver. There's others out there, but this is a good option for me. It has worked well in the past. And there's a big debate amongst techs as to what's the best way to apply thermal compound to a CPU or to a heatsink. And there really shouldn't be a debate because it depends on the CPU. So if we go to instructions here and go to Arctic Silver 5, because that's really my favorite, we'll select Intel as the CPU brand. And then we'll see a list of processors and how they recommend to install them. The trend now is the vertical line method, but there are others. Surface spread, which was common back in the day, the dot method, the horizontal line, and so on and so on. But the vertical line is the most common now. So if we click on that now for the Core i7 processor, and by the way, this applies to the 5th generation processors as well. Click on that, we'll get a whole list of instructions on how to do this. And they show you exactly what to do for your CPU. And you might have instructions for this that come with the CPU as well, or more likely with the heatsink. And our heatsink has basically the same instructions. Make sure that the triangle indicating pin 1 is at the bottom left, and then apply a very thin vertical bead of thermal compound, not all the way to the edge, but most of the length of the CPU cap. That's where you apply that to. And then you don't do anything except install the heatsink. And that's going to spread it out automatically so that it will look like this. You won't see it, but that's what will happen. So, the old days where you would spread this out with a credit card, that's not necessary anymore for most Intel CPUs. But if you want to, and if you want to get a really good connection, you can also prime or tint the heatsink. And you would do that by first cleaning it with isopropyl alcohol, making sure that there's no lint or anything on there. And then you don't want to touch it but with your fingers or anything. But then you're going to apply a little bit of thermal compound and spread it with a credit card that you've also cleaned with isopropyl alcohol. That'll prime it. You just need a tiny bit. And you do this in addition to this method on the CPU cap. Then you want to make sure you use a lint-free cloth or a coffee filter to wipe off any excess. The key here is that you don't touch anything with your fingers. You don't want any oils on the CPU cap or the heatsink. You want to make sure that everything's really clean when you make the connection between the heatsink and the CPU cap. So this is a great website to go to. Go to the source, find out what the best way is to install thermal compound for your particular CPU. And that's just a little side note there. But that's about it for this sub lesson. Make sure that you understand the difference between active and passive cooling and what liquid cooling systems are and what thermal compound, otherwise known as thermal paste, know what that is and how it works and how to apply it.